Hello, Mage fans, and welcome to Mage the Podcast, a podcast that works hard towards ascension so you don't have to. I'm your host, Adam Simpson. I'm joined by co-host Terry Robinson. Today we're going to talk to you about Dead Magic 2, Secrets and Survivors. Yes, the first Dead Magic book sold well enough that it got a sequel, and we are going to bring you all of those secrets and survivors in our episode today. But before we get into it, I was going to open it up for announcements, and actually on that note, I had two minor things to mention. This week I got my Mage Tarot deck, and this is not an original from back in the day. This is a reprint from Drive-Thru RPG. But for me, it was very interesting because I had never seen a Mage Tarot deck in person, whether old or new. And so now I've got my own deck, and I was flipping through the cards. I think they're pretty good quality, although I don't collect tarot decks, so I'm not a person to comment on that. But I'm really enjoying it. However, when I was looking through it, I was thinking, hey, I could use this during my Mage games. But actually, there are a number of cards in the minor suite that do not print their symbols very prominently. So if I was going to be trying to quickly refer to cards as I pull them out of the deck, I think I would have a hard time with this. So I might actually go with a more traditional tarot deck. Some of the examples I've seen online of the cards make them more clearly labeled. So even though I really enjoy the deck, I'm glad I picked it up. Not something I'd probably use right in the middle of games. The other thing was I picked up a book this week that I'm pretty jazzed about. I was watching an interview with James Ward, who's the inventor of the first ever science fiction role-playing game called Metamorphosis Alpha back in the 70s. And they were asking, what are you most proud of? And he said, the Storyteller's Thesaurus. And I thought, what? I have never even heard of that. It is a book that is meant to be a specialized sort of thesaurus for people who are role-playing game developers, writers, etc. And instead of giving you, another word that means basically the same thing as the word you looked up, it instead gives you examples of that word. For example, if I look up fabric, it tells me all of the kinds of real-world fabrics that have been developed over the years, which of course I know nothing about, so that can be pretty handy for me. I look up sword, and it mentions all the types of swords that different cultures have produced around the globe over the centuries, and so I think it's pretty cool. I'm looking forward to using that, and I think it might actually help me get out of a few binds when I'm preparing material for a Mage game for some people. So that's it for me for announcements. Terry, was there anything you wanted to mention?
Just that I agree that I was a little... I have the print-on-demand version of the tarot deck, and it is nice to have one that does not cost a mortgage payment, as opposed to if you try and grab the original ones. The art is a little bit different in terms of aspect, and yeah, the color is slightly shifted. If a storyteller, though, is looking for a deck to aid in storytelling, there are a few alternatives to that, and I may have an interview coming up, hopefully doing that. One is the deck from Invisible Sun called the Soothe deck. As part of the game also includes a guide to interpretation, and that is I think a 60 card deck or something like that. And I like that one because it's evocative and it's kind of intended to be surreal. In addition to that, Edward Gorey kind of created this weird alternative to the tarot deck called the Fentod pack, and it consists of 20 cards that are just odd, unpleasant images in that Edward Gorey style, plus an interpretation set to it that I am quite fond of. I will include those in the show notes. The fact that the print on demand of the Drive-Thru RPG version of the tarot is a little bit on the thin side, I strongly recommend people use sleeves if they want to take advantage of that at the table. That Storyteller Thesaurus, or that Storyteller's Thesaurus sounds pretty interesting, and new hardcovers are only $19 on Amazon, so I'm not going to say that I already hit the buy button, but it may not be long between us finishing and me hitting the buy button.
Okay, well, today we are going to be talking about Dead Magic 2, Secrets and Survivors, and as I said, this is kind of a sequel. This is the second in a series. There were a lot of Mage books that they were hoping would catch on and would produce sequels, and didn't really happen. One example is the Las Vegas City book. Apparently it didn't sell as well as some people had hoped, and so we didn't get any more City books. But we do have a second Dead Magic book. And of course, the premise of these is now that magic has become more difficult around the world for mages in the events of Revised Edition, they are looking for other sources. And one idea is to travel the world and unearth magic that has not been used by anyone for centuries and try it out. It might need to be adapted, it might need to be altered, but it might be some really strong stuff that would give one faction an advantage in the conflicts that are going on. So this book was put out in 2003. It has 6 authors. It clocks in at 149 pages. And Terry, can you start us off on a walkthrough?
Sure. So this book opens, as so many do, with a prologue. And I can give you a dramatic interpretation of what it is, but it is a very angry Etrurian that is very angry that Etruria is no longer around, that is very angry that the Romans that crushed Etruria are also no longer around, who is, on the whole, having a very bad, not happy, not nice day. And he takes that out on a lot of very undeserving mages in the form of throwing demons and the restless dead at them. At one point, he just starts identifying everyone as being hermetics, which later, I think, proves to be kind of funny. And this is just like when people are like, the hermetics are arrogant, I'm like, no. This guy is arrogant. But then again, he's like, spoilers, we get to more information later. He's a lich with an arete of 9. At that point, I don't know if it's arrogance or not. If you can deliver the goods, we get the impression that there are a bunch of mages that had gotten information via maybe the Sphinx or some other source who waken this ancient lich, and this lich is not happy. And at its end, kind of is able to sneak away after discovering a little bit of modern technology in the form of the Desert Eagle handgun, which for those of you outside the US is a handgun so large if you put wheels on it, it's a cannon. And once again proving the most potent sphere, the 10th sphere in Mage, is the sphere of gun. I thought it was just a ripping fun tale, and it was really fun seeing the world from this Etrurian character's point of view, especially because like you get the idea that millennia have passed, and he's just been kind of like twiddling his thumbs in the meantime, like filling out warranty cards and so on, and it's just utterly indignant at the world that he returns to.
I quite agree. I've read a lot of prologue fictions by now in mage books, but this one was fun to read. There was cool action. I was enjoying the characters and the interaction. I was like, I really like this. This is really getting me worked up for the book.
Yeah, of prologues, this is the one where I'm like, oh man, I want to see where this goes. The introduction is entitled That Which Was Lost, and it sets up the idea that, as Adam said, that the Rogue Council, via the Sphinx, is sending out messages that say, hey, there are areas of magic we have not made contact with in quite some time, and they may contain useful keys to deal with the problems of the modern world. It has a warning that says, hey, things like Ragnarok, evil tikis dedicated to deep sea gods, immortal liches, and Kali herself, the goddess of raw destruction, are maybe some dark and nasty themes that you want to consider. And then it says, oddly enough, there is no Black Dog Game Factory logo. And I'm like, that's interesting. Like, I wonder why. I don't know if there's a story behind there, but there is not. This one isn't quite as graphic as the first one, but still, the material in here can be quite visceral in like a literal sense, meaning containing viscera, and also there are mentions of cannibalism. So if that's not your cup of tea, we look forward to talking to you in 2 weeks about Infinite Tapestry, beyond the barrier of the Infinite Tapestry. It just kind of goes through. It doesn't list a theme or a mood or anything like that, and it just kind of gets into it.
I'm just pleased to see that the Rogue Council is tied in again. As I said, if I'm going to deal with the events of Revised Edition in my chronicle, then the Rogue Council is, as a storyteller, is a really, really nice handle for me to get a grip on. And so I was really glad that they were well tied in again.
Yeah. The first of the 6 sections, and we will likely be taking this a little bit out of order just so it's back and forth between Adam and me, is Sad Islands in Strange Seas, and is on the magic of Polynesia. And it involves a young dream speaker meeting up with a Polynesian mage, a Huna of some sort, and they go on a boat trip. And over the course of it, they talk about the magic of Polynesia. So they kind of define Polynesia as the triangle going from New Zealand to Easter Island to Hawaii and back. And that's not a bad definition. It does not include the entirety of the islands of the Pacific. It doesn't include Melanesia and Micronesia, for instance. which is fine. We never got, I think, any Melanesian magic, but it's one of those cases also where they talk about a large spread of islands. At the end of the day, most of the population in that region is going to be at the two centers of mass of New Zealand and Hawaii. So those are going to be kind of your big players in there. And it goes through a tour, and it lists generally the name that settlers used for it, colonialists use, as well as transliteration of a word that is likely more close to whatever the denizens of that island use for themselves. And I found it interesting just to kind of track culture in the form of what terms I was familiar with and which ones weren't. And I'll just give you some key points just to kind of give some examples of what can happen to an island. For instance, they go over Tonga. It was constantly at war. It never got a chance to practice deep introspective magic because of war. They came up with a lot of very martial, very violent effects, but things that are more subtle. Generally, they don't have a way of doing it. They were able to largely successfully repel Europeans, but ultimately wound up adopting a lot of their ways in technology. Most of the people there that practice magic, it's a form of hedge magic. So that's just a case where they gave a half page on that. Samoa is mostly converted and overrun with choristers. The Marquesas are composed of two archipelagos. Magical tattooing came from one, and tattooing is a cultural phenomenon that they had a problem with cannibalism that was a byproduct of too many fertility tikis, and that human sacrifice was also common. It is the origin of the popularity of the shrunken head. And it makes a point to say that different people were eaten on different occasions for different reasons. And I'm like, oh, good. There was a system for cannibalism. That's good. But just kind of one of the weird things you run into when you're reading books for Mage. It talks about Hawaii being the most magical of the islands, that there used to be an additional Hawaiian island, but during a magical war, Molokini was sunk during the Kahuna Wars, which was a war that kind of raged from 700 to about 1400, and is listed as one of the reasons that the peoples of the area ultimately wound up spreading out, just to kind of get away from it. We go through a bunch of other small islands. James Cook is listed as being a void seeker, that I thought was an interesting little drop in. James Cook, technocrat. It's been a while since we've gotten a historical figure that was declared to be awakened. We get the island of Tokelau, which is host to the spirits of the oceanic voids, where the Tanawas are demons in the water between the islands. Some of the tikis there are actual idols. And then it goes into New Zealand, that it is ancient and full of mana, still has a large number of untouched nodes. It is the most recently settled of those islands, and the places where natives are most effectively making headway in preserving their practices as well as consolidating political power. It mentions that Kapiti Island holds the most powerful node in the southern hemisphere, that it needed to be hidden, and that during the period where colonists were trying to set up farming operations, they worked very hard to kind of prevent the quintessence there from allowing plants to grow. It can only be visited now via permit. They also used Rapa Nui or Easter Island as a kind of this case in point where the kahunas became rock stars. It was very fertile, created giant correspondence tikis to protect them during the Kahuna War, but that blocked their ability to move around. And after there was a resource collapse, they were unable to leave. I don't know why they didn't just take down these tikis, but maybe things are more complicated than we are first led to believe. They mentioned that Rongo Rongo, the script of Rapa Nui, is kind of like a Polynesian form of Enochian, that is a spirit language that can be used to control and guide spirits. After that big old tour, we get information on how the magic of the region works. And in most cases, in most of the sections, things are pretty light on the whole like paradigm thing, like where does magic actually come from? But we usually get a pretty hearty serving of rotes, and this is no exception. Some of the effects that kind of struck to me was the Akuakuma Haka, which is a guided fireball. So it's your standard forces plus prime effect, but plus spirit. So it contains a fire elemental that chases down the guy that you want to light on fire. That is so much more menacing. Yeah, it's not nearly as fast, but there's like an intelligent agent trying to find you to light you on fire. This is one of those cases where Romero zombies are much scarier than Danny Boyle zombies, at least to me. They give the rote of Rogue Wave, which is where a wave comes out of nowhere and kind of knocks you over. At the end of the day, the actual damage it does is pretty underwhelming, but the thing I liked here was it gave you like 5 ways to do it. It's like you can use entropy 2 or forces 2 or entropy 3 or correspondence 2 and matter and prime. And I like when the game does that, when it gives you multiple ways of getting to the same place and explains how each one of them would work. There's some pretty specialized ones. One allows you to just summon sharks. Another one allows you to control the form of a wereshark, a rokea. Weresharks are one of my favorite of the Fera that are listed. We get some other flavorful ones like wave walking, where you can walk on waves. And I'm like, that seems vulgar. And it's like, there are coral atolls everywhere. People are used to people just like walking on the ocean. I'm like, are they? Okay, good to know. They give us the rote of Kaumaha, which is a sacrifice rote where vulgarity is represented by how eager the spirits are to receive the mana or quintessence from the sacrificed entity, where it is interesting that if you sacrifice someone against their will, it is vulgar. But if you sacrifice someone against their will, but who's been a real jerk to everyone, it's not vulgar. And I wish there was more magic like that in Mage, where the cosmos is like, yep, your neighbor was a jerk. Their tree kept dropping leaves on your lawn. Not vulgar to have their house light on fire. And that is that is a kind of justice in the world of darkness I can get behind. We get a bunch of wonders. And one of the things that a lot of the wonders in this book do is, instead of doing large flashy effects, it is accumulation of small things. For instance, the Hei Tiki is a type of tiki that generates a whole bunch of small things that just kind of makes it easier to live. You get a extra point of stamina. It's easier for you to heal. You get one more bruised health level. And I thought that was good. And then it goes up to some much larger ones. We get some information on tattoo, spelled T-A-T-U, which is skin magic. These are very evocative and very flavorful, and I like them. One was a set of lines around the neck that automatically turn into gills when beneath water, to the high end where you are covered from head to toe on every point of visible skin with repeated pentagons that kind of make it look like a crab shell that results in you getting 4 or 5 additional dice that soak all damage. So congratulations, you're a mage with Fortitude 5. It goes over the history of tikis, that they are based on the first human who became a god through ancestor worship, and they represent the right to coexist with spirits. They are sculpted to look like the god they house, so no two should be exactly the same. Creating one often requires exotic materials. There's much activity to cleanse the tiki, and they do a lot of the dull work of repelling tsunamis or helping the local fish population. Importantly, they are not fetishes. They are focuses and they are wonders. They do not necessarily house a spirit. And I think this is a perfectly reasonable way of viewing things. Spirit can often be complicated in Mage when you're like, but the spirit's doing it. You're like, not really. The mage is having the spirit do it, and ultimately they're rolling their arete, so it's not going to be a fetish at the end of the day. And I like the fact that they didn't just go, it's a spirit, it's automatically a fetish. It ends that section with some ideas of how to use this magic in a campaign, which I liked. And this was under the Chronicle Notes section, and it says, like many dead magic groups, it focuses on the unknown. The system for magic is almost fully fleshed out. We get an idea of what a bunch of the instruments could look like. My only criticism was it kind of lacked a mapping of spheres. Even a short description of this is how different spheres are viewed. There were a few cases where it's like, forces is fundamentally different because volcanoes are always nearby. And that kind of changed the view of forces and matter. A little bit more on that would have been useful. The plot ideas is also where it chooses to tie itself to other books. Adam and I have talked about books in the past where it's like, hey, there's this really cool idea, and for more information on it, get this different book from a different line. Otherwise, a lot of the stuff won't make sense. And by the way, this is revised, and our editors are very busy and very harried, so the reference we give you may not actually be accurate. I'm looking at you, book that referred to Sorcerer's Crusade Companion for information on the Ministry of Works from the Middle Kingdom that wasn't there. So here, it chose to do that generally in asides, where it said, hey, if you want more information on this, consult this book for this plot idea. And when the circle that you draw around it is that narrow, I appreciate it. On the whole, I really like this section. I thought it was fleshed out. I imagine the history section probably needs to be updated to current scholarship and current interpretation of that scholarship. That'll be an idea that carries throughout all of these. But I was quite pleased with it, and I think it gave a lot of fun effects that could really wrong-foot a group and make them feel like they are in some other place where even if they have technology or magic to their side, they someone else can still put up a good fight, and it kind of justifies a, hey, there's kind of a reason you could go here in the form of this area is very rich with mana and so on, and kind of has a unique relationship to the natural world that may prove to be useful. It would have been nice if they had put a finer bow on that, and the whole idea of what are the Kopaloe up to was kind of just like, on the whole, I'll take it.
First off, we start off with this long in-character fiction. The older mage is helping the younger mage escape Seattle because it's gotten too hot for him. And during that, they're in a canoe, and so the older mage just says, hey, you know what, I'm a professor, and I'm going to lecture you. And the other guy's like, oh, great, I'm going to listen to the lecture because this canoe is very small. And it seemed a very awkward narrative device. I mean, a story within a story isn't always a bad idea, but it just didn't work very well for me here. So I thought that they could have found a better narrative device to get across what they wanted to. When they're talking about the different island groups early on, they talk about Tonga and Samoa, and I was not okay with that. It basically said, oh, those Tongans and Samoans, they're a bunch of losers, and they're not good at magic, and they gave in to Western culture because they're just a bunch of losers. I mean, it calls all of Samoa like a giant trailer park or something. It's like, I'm reading through, it's like, okay, I'm sorry, I'm not okay with that. I mean, if you can give some half-decent reason why they're not so good at magic or why they focus on something else, but instead of saying that they're all dummies and they suck, I mean, that was a bit much for me. And also, throughout the whole in-character fiction, there was so much hatred and strong bias just pouring out. And I know a lot of people say, oh, well, you see, that's the unreliable narrator, that's an in-character fiction piece. And I don't know, it always seemed to me like a too convenient cat's paw. If the writer wants to put something in the chapter, he'll put it in the chapter. Oh, but you see, it's this unreliable narrator, so hey, don't look at me. It's like, no, I am going to look at you. You wrote the chapter. You put it in there. This is worth discussing, actually. Don't just use that dodge. So, the strong hatred and bias of this in-character fiction was a little heavy for me, and it just kept hitting me again and again throughout the chapter. The dark sleeping beings, most deep under the water, who are mostly around the island group of Tokelau, that was very interesting to me. I like being able to pull that up and say that if you want to take a chronicle and put it just in Polynesia, where it's Polynesian mages dealing with other Polynesian mages, and you don't really worry about the outside, there's a way to divide it up into good guys and bad guys and have some suggestion of internal factions. So I thought that was really cool. They wrote Kaumaha, which is basically sacrificing human beings for quintessence. I like the idea that it was in there, but the fact that you can take a regular sleeper and sacrifice them and get 10 quintessence out of them, I think that's too much quintessence. I think that if you put that in a game and give players or significant NPCs access to that, I think it's going to start to imbalance things. I always like to keep a good watch on who are the vampires and who are not the vampires, because in World of Darkness we have actual vampires that get their sustenance from people, and it's like, okay, that works, that's thematically correct. But when mages turn into energy vampires, it's like, okay, it's time to keep an eye on this and make sure we're really getting what we want out of this game. There, on page 36, there are sorceress tiki that sorcerers and mages can use for quintessence and aid in their magic. That was kind of dark stuff, talking about the use of human blood, and they get quickly absorbed by these hungry sorcerers tiki. And there wasn't much mention of resonance. I would put some pretty strong negative resonance on that, because that's the kind of thing where it has a good use in a game. It's so convenient that a player wants to use it, but then they start going down a wrong path, and then the player and the other players have something to set up some conflict within the game. So I like it, but I just think that we should emphasize, hey, there's going to be bad resonance around a practice like this. At the end of the story, there were end of the chapter, I'm sorry. There were 7 story ideas. I thought that was pretty cool. That got my imagination going, and I was pleased to see that in there. Now, this might sound like a nitpick, but when I pick up a book called Dead Magic, I'm expecting to find magic that is dead, no one's doing it anymore, and you have to dig up old things to even learn how to do it once again. In this case, it isn't really dead magic. You could argue it's obscure magic, but then again, you could argue it isn't. It's really foreign magic. There's a number of mages out in this one part of the world who do it, and they don't train outsiders. And so, okay, I guess it's kind of obscure. You have to go there to learn it. There's a fair number of people doing this. In fact, the Kopaloe are a craft that we learn about in 2nd edition, and they fit into this group, and they have mixed in with other mages from around the globe. And so how obscure is this magic? And the storytellers are going to have to decide that on their own. So that wraps up my thoughts on the Polynesian chapter.
Following the Polynesian chapter is Wide Awake in the Dreamtime, Native Australia. Adam, can you tell us about the Outback?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I really enjoyed this chapter. So this chapter is about native Australia. That means the Aboriginal people of Australia, not the European settlers and their descendants. That means there is no place here for Crocodile Dundee imitations. I know. I'm disappointed too.
In fact, they're done at a penalty, which pleased me to no end when I saw it.
We start out with an account of a road train disaster. In the Australian outback, large trucks are linked together and driven in a straight line through many miles of wilderness to reach outposts on Australia's east coast. So that's what a road train is. This disaster was observed by technocrats, and they want to know who caused it. We shift to a series of journal entries made by a technocrat undercover in Australia. He is sending these entries to Zoka, an eco-terrorist we've seen several times before in revised edition books. The technocrat is investigating dimensional disturbances in the outback, and to do so must gather information from Aboriginal settlements. His hidden recording equipment is discovered and confiscated, but rather than running him out of town on a rail, the native people require him to go native and wander the outback with a small group of their own mages. The hardships of traditional Aboriginal life, together with separation from modern technologies, opens the technocrat to what his hosts wanted to show him. The Dreamtime is not a superstition, but a real dimensional phenomenon, and he's initiated into Aborigine culture to the extent that he can enter it. Although clever, I thought this in-character fiction was a little too long, a little longer than it needed to be. Next up is 2.5 pages of real-world Australian history. This is a brief overview, including the Aboriginal people's perspective. It focuses on what's behind the current situation in Australia, so I found it helpful. Next up is my favorite part, the Dreamtime. We learned what it is, how it works, and game rules for interacting with it. The Dreamtime is an unusual spirit realm created long ago that covers much of Australia. Its borders shift. It is intimately connected with the Aboriginal people and their culture, and only those who are properly initiated can detect it and visit it. The systems here make it clear the Dreamtime is unique with its own character. Magic even works differently here. At the same time, this section introduces a new concept to mage, and that is shallow realms. The Dreamtime is an example of a shallow realm, but others may exist, and mages can make new ones. To understand shallow realms, I have to put them in context. Newer mage fans may find this interesting. Horizon realms and shallowings were introduced in Book of Chantries early in first edition. A horizon realm is an umbral realm created by mages. They form on the near side of the horizon that separates the near umbra from the deep umbra. Passageways through the near umbra usually connect them to Earth. A shallowing is when a place on Earth, usually near a node, looks ordinary, but anything or anyone there may be suddenly moved to the penumbra, near umbra, or the horizon realm connected to that node. A shallow realm is a realm created by mages that forms between Earth and the near umbra. It isn't really inside either. When horizon realms are created, the makers decide what is in them. Shallow realms duplicate the geography of the place on Earth where they were created. Because shallow realms are not on the other side of the gauntlet, they are not subject to the Avatar Storm. During the events of Revised Edition, this means any faction of mages who can create new shallow realms will get a big advantage. This is ancient, lost magic of great value, certainly worth traveling the world to rediscover. That's why it's hinted in this chapter that the Rogue Council is sending tradition mages to Australia and asking Aboriginal mages to receive them. Apart from the Avatar Storm, I think shallow realms are a really cool idea. Makes this book a keeper for me. We get a list of spirits that exist in the Dreamtime. These spirits are willing to form relationships with mages initiated into the Dreamtime and operate not unlike totem spirits. 13 rotes that function in connection with the Dreamtime are provided, along with 3 wonders. The Songline Soaring rote lets a mage travel with spirit instead of correspondence, that is, travel around Australia. I think it's best to let correspondence do its job. The next section is what I call shadow history. This is history only known to mages. Although there are some great ideas here, the section is too long and, frankly, too detailed. I think it's better to leave some things mysterious. We also get some background on how the traditions and technocracy have interacted with Australia over the years, making it clear that both groups have little inside knowledge there. We conclude the chapter with some notable locations in Australia. There are a number of interesting spots here, but what stands out to me are the Pine Gap Research Facility and Alice's Roadhouse. Pine Gap is a large construct deep in the outback where the New World Order and the Void Engineers monitor the continent's communications and coordinate research for dimensional science. Alice's Roadhouse is a tradition-friendly watering hole and supply station that keeps good relations with the Aboriginal people. The Roadhouse seems perfect for inserting into chronicles that involve the Outback. I'd like to offer some comments of my own on this chapter. For my chronicles, the Dreamtime is less ethnocentric. This chapter explains how the Dreamtime will open itself up to an Aborigine who is totally a part of Western culture and doesn't care about his own culture, while a mystically aware person of European descent who is in tune with nature and learning Aboriginal ways may be totally ignored. I say the Dreamtime is in touch with those who are initiated to it and doesn't dwell so much on ethnic background. This chapter holds to the idea first put forth by Brucato in first and second edition of making magic conform to real-world culture's ideas of magic, instead of Stuart Wick's idea of letting magic and mystical phenomenon be more creative and otherworldly. More than once, this chapter tells us the Void Engineers are very close to fully understanding the Dreamtime from a techno-magical perspective. This can be used by storytellers in a number of ways. Your stories can feature the players trying to prevent the technocracy from perfecting this research. The players can fight to prevent the technocracy from shutting down or invading the Dreamtime. Remember, understanding the Dreamtime will lead to understanding shallow realms, and don't the players want to say in which faction holds that knowledge? The rotes and wonders offered in this chapter are connected to the Dreamtime, so they won't be of use once the players leave Australia. This can make stories in Australia unique, but it also gives the storyteller hints on how to make each shallow realm extraordinary once the players start making their own. It is stated the Middle Umbra of Australia is mostly barren and empty. While this might be an interesting mystery for your players, it is too much for me to accept. Also, the Dreamtime is so much like the Middle Umbra that it makes me want to change things around for my own chronicles. I would make the Middle Umbra full of the usual content, while the Dreamtime would have spirits and other things associated with ancient humans' ideas of nature. The spirits of the animals and the land would be more like humans and more interested in things that humans value. I'd allow more spirits from the High Umbra to infiltrate. Finally, the sidebar on page 61 tells us werewolves get into the Dreamtime, but non-European werewolves keep the knowledge mostly away from European werewolves. I would say werewolves sometimes stumble into the Dreamtime, but consider it artificial and really don't like it. So, Terry, what were your thoughts on the Dreamtime and Native Australia chapter?
I thought this chapter was quite simply great. I liked the fiction. It was a little bit too long, especially with a bunch of the setup, but just following the character's journey, especially when the character finally receives kind of a spirit patron and it's movie. I love when the game does that. They're like, okay, if we had this practice and we were to introduce it to this group of people, how would it be molded to make more sense to them? So when the character just kind of stumbles upon this like Outback movie theater, it's like, what the hell is that? They're like, oh, well, that's what's speaking to you. And I'm like, this is pretty neat. I like the idea of there being shallow realms. I like it would have been neat if there had been like a throwaway line that's like, oh, by the way, one of 4 major shallow realms left in the world. And that's something that my
little, awesome.
That's something my little kid brain would have been like, yes, I'm gonna build one in my backyard with my friends. I thought it was interesting that the difficulty of crossing over increases if anyone has said good day, mate, in the last 5 minutes. And mage authors sometimes do it where they're a little heavy-handed, but this one I actually thought was kind of funny, because I picture the characters meeting someone who's about to take them into this for whatever reason, and one of the characters just snarkily is like, good day, and the person then leading the ritual is like, okay, well, we have to wait 5 minutes. Thanks, Gary. And just everyone's kind of like standing around waiting for that as the character just sits there embarrassedly. I like that it gives us rules for creating like a giant magic effect that actually does something that isn't necessarily too powerful. I thought it was super fun. The tie-in with the Bastet, that you're like, yeah, this is essentially what a Den realm is. This almost felt like a sudden chunk of the storyteller's handbook was just kind of dropped in here. It includes information on Dreamtime lore and a bunch of spirits that you can interact with, and the different set of cultural associations. I always love seeing those when it's like, oh, this is the association that they have with koala. Koala is a terrible example because it's not like you're going to find that anywhere else, but like, hey, this is our cultural association with ants or owls or something like that. I find that interesting. The rotes I thought were balanced, and the dot requirements were pretty good. The Awaken history was pretty neat, and I really liked the, oh, by the way, the Void Engineers are about to crack this nut. That just dripped with potential, either you being the Void Engineers that crack that nut and suddenly need to make sense of this place, or you needing to stop them, or what happens when it goes in. in there. The geographical information about Australia is a little bit outdated, as you would expect from a book that's 18 years old at this point, but that's fine. And it even gives you information on, hey, this is what the Rogue Council's up to. I thought this was a great balanced chapter. If they ever produce a book that is just 6 of these, I'm all over it. My only concern is that, in general, from what I understand, the Aboriginal people of Australia generally do not like their beliefs represented in a fictional setting. I know that there are a number of games that are set that have been like, hey, we would like to include Aboriginal beliefs in it. And a lot of the members of that community are just like, no, this is our sacred practice. We would not like our beliefs represented in that fictional way. Again, I am not an expert in this topic. Do some checking. There may be some elements that are still usable or that make reference to it. But in general, I try and avoid certain core sacred beliefs that people use within games, but a bunch of it, even just the information on the Outback and the associations with animals and so on, and some of the cultural practices and maybe some of the secret history, I feel are all still entirely usable. This one was just great.
Definitely. Well, what's up next?
On the other end of the spectrum, we have The Beat Goes On, Shakti and Shiva. I'm a little bit snarky, but this is just, it's too short to have an opinion on it, really. This section goes on about Shaktism, which is, Shakti was the consort of Shiva and changes representations throughout the cycle of creation in various structures of Hindu belief. I generally don't refer to Hinduism as a monolithic thing, in the same way that it would be foolish to refer to all of Christians having the exact same belief set. So sometimes I will even go so far as to say Hinduisms. But this is a Thanatoic character who finds themselves in Kolkata on vacation and is kind of seduced by a swarthy, in the traditional sense, man, and is... the perspective is moving back and forth to this kind of bubbly white hooker with a heart of gold that is on vacation, and eventually turning into an emanation of Kali, the Dark Mother, whose dance across creation will bring its destruction. The idea in here is reasonable in that it talks briefly about how the resonance maps quite nicely onto the gods Shiva, Brahma, and Vishnu, and that the counterpoint to the loudness of Shaktiism is Shaivism, who generally more thoroughly revere Shiva, that it introduces a rote called karmic inversion, which lets you move damage to another mage, but only when crossing the avatar and only after torturing them for a while, and it has to be another mage, and there's a rote that lets you slowly increase your appearance. There's no information on paradigm, like where mage power comes from, really, or what the tools are. I'm not sure what caused this to occur, but I mean, it's like 7 pages in total, and one of those pages is just taken up with art and the cover item. We get a few small plot ideas. This seems to continue the trend of Mage the Ascension being like, India is huge and rich in terms of people and practice. Thus, we are going to ignore it. And that kind of left me hungering for more. If I only had 7 pages, I probably would have completely dropped a lot of the in-world fiction and so on. This really felt like this was an extended story seed idea where, hey, this mage is turned into an embodiment of Kali and is out there doing something. Your characters have to go stop it and confront this character as her 8 arms holding the 8 weapons of war rose and dance victory across creation or something like that. I really don't have much more to say on this. Adam, you are vastly more familiar with the cultural practices of the Indian subcontinent. What did you think about it?
I would have to agree with you. It was 7 pages. Much of that was taken up with art and in-character fiction. It's not long enough. It doesn't even supply enough length to create its own context in which to discuss the things it's pitching. For example, this book is supposed to be about dead magic. Magic that is really, really obscure or no one's using anymore, and you've got to go dig it up, and what you might be able to do if you were to dig it up. That content is not in this chapter. I mean, we get this frightening example of one person being invested with some sort of spirit that turns her into a frightening being that's causing a lot of havoc, but then it stops. And you're like, well, how am I supposed to interpret this? I mean, where is the dead magic? who has it. They have some rotes in there, so I guess you might say this is an example of it. But I mean, other than that, there's just not much to work with here. There's a number of story ideas at the end, and usually I like story ideas, but in this case, there's so little context that I don't really know much of what to do with these story ideas. Okay, there's a frightening being tearing the place up and running across the map. I've seen stuff like this before. I could have come up with that myself. I mean, I need more to go on here before I get excited about this. Also, there is some information about the Shakti and Shiva characters from Hinduism. I was a bit disappointed that the information about Shiva was too simplistic. I mean, it's like the kind of material you expect to find in 20-year-old high school textbooks or something. I mean, there's a lot more going on here. There's a lot more to this figure in Hinduism on the Indian subcontinent. I think the author didn't do the research very well. We're not even given very good material here when they do try to give it to us. So I am sorry to say that this chapter was rather a disappointment.
The next section in order is the Shadows of the World Tree, the Norse, but we're going to skip over that, and we are going to discuss European shamanism. Adam, could you tell us about European shamanism while I quickly hit the preheat?
Yeah, certainly. The European shamanism chapter was actually second to last in the book, but this is a topic that has been covered before. I recall some good material in the revised Dreamspeaker book, tradition book. But here we see ancient magic that has either been lost for centuries or is practiced by very few mages who keep a very low profile. We start with several short in-character fiction pieces. These pieces do not connect to each other, so I found them confusing at first. They each try to display a particular magical effect that modern mages can't do or can't do very well. Next is a page describing the shaman and how this material could be useful to modern mages. The meat of the chapter is 4 sections covering the ancient magic of Ireland, Britain, Finland, and the Germanic tribes. These sections offer notable people, gods, and other beings from these regions, along with cultural notes, paradigm information, rotes, and wonders. The rotes Shape-Changing Curse and Binding Song stood out to me as potent rotes that modern mages would want to learn. Also, the 9 sacred hazelnut trees of wisdom that exist in the Umbra in the Ireland section tempt me to use them in a game. We round out the chapter with 3 pages on how modern mages can benefit from discovering old shamanic magic. It includes specific ideas on what they can gain, a sidebar on how it might be adapted in-game to modern paradigms, and story hooks. Beware the layout problem on page 131. Text above the sidebar and beneath the sidebar were accidentally swapped, so that will really throw you until you figure it out. As for my thoughts on the chapter, this chapter should have been the first one in the book. I say that because more than any other chapter, this one makes it clear what the writer's assumptions are for this material. It also gives clear ideas on how old magic might be useful to modern mages. If this were at the front of the book, later chapters would have gone down easier. One thing to keep in mind for this chapter, but also the whole book, is rarity. Many of the rotes I see here are easy enough to see as possible using standard sphere magic. It seems the authors are assuming certain effects will be declared rare or unknown by the storyteller, so the players can go searching for these lost rotes. If you want to use the Dead Magic books in your chronicles, I suggest you choose a list of rotes and declare them unknown. Don't let NPCs or the players do those kinds of rotes, even if they have the spheres for them, until they discover the lost magic. But that basically sums up my thoughts on this chapter. Terry, what were your thoughts?
I have difficulty taking the term Salmon of Wisdom as something that I will hear, where it's like Cuchulainn was preparing the Salmon of Wisdom and then licked his fingers and he gained all the wisdom, and I'm like, okay, that's a bit too much for me. So the Salmon of Wisdom and the chestnuts of such were a little bit much for me, and like as a white guy, I feel comfortable more so than most cases being like, what's actually going on here? And it was flavorful, but it did not explain the worldview to me at all. I don't feel it was a collection of bits. It really didn't do the lift of making it magey. It was a bunch of stories that a storyteller could include, or here's a tomb that we need to raid for this particular thing, or these are a bunch of historical practices, but it didn't really tie it into a contemporary type of practice that anyone would have, or say, hey, what is the worldview that produced this? I did like the quick tour of that. It was a bunch of countries that were included. The other moment where I had difficulty taking it seriously was when we got the Spirit Toot wrote of enter the sauna, and it gives a good justification of what that means. That one day a year in Finnish areas, the sauna were left as a place for the spirits to use, and that humans did not visit on that day. A little more on what instruments would have looked like. I understand that that's not actually something that would be used then. It was nice to learn about the picks outside the context of the Black Spiral Dancers. And a pronunciation guide. I thought this, more so than many sections, this one really could have used a little bit of guide, because Irish languages are not easy, in my opinion. It's not bad. I would have liked a little bit more, so it was a little bit on the weak side, but I certainly think it's usable.
And let's backtrack and hear about the Norse.
Yep. This section is entitled The Shadows of the World Ash, the Norse, and we get Norse Magic. And this is something that has been gone over in Mage any number of times in light detail, and here it goes over it in much heavier detail. The frame narrative is a character is hanging themselves in order to gain wisdom in emulation of Odin, the Allfather, and at some point they get hit in the face by an acorn being wielded by a squirrel, Ratatosk, who knows all goings-on of the world tree, and is also familiar with magic because they were there when Odin received the runes. Odin hangs suspended for 9 days with a spear in their side. Ratatosk just had to watch, and that really seems like a way easier way of getting the runes in the grand scheme of things. And it kind of divides magic into two strains, a kind of a masculine and a feminine one, the masculine one involving singing and runes, and the feminine one involving spinning and weaving and poisoning and a few other things in like potion craft and such. We get a quick tour of the 9 realms, and this is basically what you got in whatever child's Norse book you grew up with, that are like, this is where the elves are, this is where the dwarves are, this is where the giants are. And then as they tour, they find that the wall that was holding back Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, is gone. And then they go to the vast halls where Odin and the Enherar are, the just dead who had been chosen by the Valkyries. And those halls are empty. And he's like, uh-oh, what could be happening here? And then Ratatosk is like, well, guess Ragnarok is going to be in your realm. Have fun with that. And you're like, which I think is like a really cool setup. And if you, like me, are a fan of first edition Scion, is right there. It indicates that Loki has escaped, that the fair folk are around, and they are beautiful and cold, and really gives off big Changeling the Lost energy. It talks about fertility magic and so on, and then it goes into specific rotes. I'm not going to dwell on this for too long because this is something that Josh Heath and I did an extended version of in the Paradigm Deep Dive Norse Magic, as well as the publication Weird and Weft, which Josh and I did for the Storyteller Vault. But this, where we had one goal, and it was, we're going to talk about Norse magic without talking about the runes. And here the runes are talked about quite heavily. It goes through the entirety of the Elder Futhark and what they are used for, and then gives a whole bunch of rotes. And the rotes here are really, I don't want to quite say phoned in, but they're really just restatements of a lot of the rotes that are in the core book. And it just says what rune would be tied to them, and it doesn't make it much more interesting than that, where it's like, sing this rune, and this will happen. And like the whole idea of rune singing wasn't gone to in too much detail. Is that like the equivalent of someone just like holding a letter for a while? Like if someone were to think that we were rune singers, would it just be someone going, be until something happened? I'm not entirely sure. And then it goes into a bunch of other sets of rotes, the Spakona rotes, which come from women's magic, the role of wife and mother, that draws on spinning and weaving and resonates with the Norns and the threads of fate. These I thought were quite interesting. And it talks about Seder as well, the shamanic practice that often involves rhythmic chanting to focus the mind. A cloak is often involved to allow one to travel to other places. A seat cushion stuffed with hen feathers that kind of indicates your office, the use of amber and jet, the involvement of herbs and potions, and the goal being to gain an intuitive understanding of Orlog, the nature of things. The Spakona practitioner staff is kind of their symbol of office, their spinning staff, as well as the importance of smithcraft. One of the rotes is called Laying of Hands, and it allows you to predict future injuries. How this is useful, you got me. It's like, yep, you're going to get shot. Okay, wise woman, weaver of destinies, what should I do now? Try not to get shot. Okay. It does include some very flavorful things like the Gorning Stalker, the wound-proof shirt that heals or protects. You could create an inverted version that poisons folk on the other end of things. It talks about how a lot of the spirit effects would focus on talking with the dead as opposed to traditional, like, nature spirits and so on. A bunch of variants of mind effects and so on to do that. One of the things it does that that I don't recall many of the other sections doing is it talks about what a Norse avatar would look like, and it gives recommendations that it may be a form of the gods talking to someone or whispering wisdom. Many of the gods had animals associated with them, and they may pass you wisdom, whether they be Thor's goat or Great Odin's ravens. That is specifically a reference to the movie Anchorman, which I adore to no end. It indicates that seekings can take the form of vigils or trials, and that weaving and crafting folk may simply lose themselves in their work and kind of emerge having completed a seeking along the way. It really recommends ability aids magic rolls. So in a lot of cases, it's like, hey, most of these characters are going to have like 4 dots in crafts or 4 dots in performance. And if you do a charisma plus performance roll or something like that to aid an effect, for each 2 successes, you get an automatic success on the associated arete roll. That lets you get to some pretty big dice pools if you start allowing that, so your mileage may vary. It also talks about how Norse belief is represented in the traditions. This is something that we kind of got a bunch of information out in Guide to the Traditions, and it introduces or reintroduces a number of groups that I thought were quite interesting. One was the Brotherhood of the Red Christ, who see Jesus' vigil on the cross during crucifixion as being like Odin's, and they themselves undertake crucifixion as a personal test. That is way more metal than most Celestial Chorus groups, and I am fine with that. It talks about the Hagalaz, which fought Nazis and are now largely made of Nazis or something like that. They talk about how the practitioners that are part of the Dream Speakers are generally welcome in either the Barudi or the Red Spear Society. The Euthanatoi have Yggdrasil's Keepers. House Titulus enjoys the notion of personal trials. And it talks about how a lot of female practitioners in the Verbena have participated in the Circle of Akacha, which is a group of female weavers. On the whole, I thought that this was maybe not perfectly calibrated to a mage game. It's not quite the Australia chapter, but I thought it was pretty good on the whole. It gave you a bunch of actionable things you could use. That quick reference to the Elder Futhark that we've all been clamoring for over these years, we finally got. The frame narrative was fun and introduced a bunch of ideas. The idea that Earth is going to host Ragnarok, that Midrealm is going to be where that final battle occurs, I think is a pretty good setup. Adam, what'd you think?
Well, for me, it was interesting to note that this chapter talks about magic that is not dead, not even obscure. It's might be considered foreign. This is magical practices that are not very hard to learn from the traditions, from disparates, from all these different sources. So I guess I would say this chapter is really more on paradigm than it is about lost magic or powerful secret magic or something like that. But Norse magic, as you said, has been covered before in published mage books. But this level of detail really is nice. I think I counted 24 runes. It showed what they look like, what they're called, what they are involved with. And there was a little bit of overlap, but also a little bit of difference between them, which is intriguing for me. I think it might be fun to use in a game if one of my players decided they wanted to connect with Norse magic. As I was reading through this chapter, I was thinking more about, I guess, perhaps identity or power level. What I mean is, if you read about Norse magic and say, okay, so this is not hidden, there's mages doing this, so what? Are they in the Verbena? Are they in the Dream Speakers? Are they even in the Celestial Chorus? And, well, yeah, they are. They can be found in different groups, but I think the approach is important here. If you are taking more of an early days of mage approach, then you would say that the rotes and the material here is kind of a starting point for mages to build their magic on. They don't have to dot every I and cross every T, follow every rote and element to perfect detail. It's just sort of material to build on. Let your players have a little flexibility there. If you are going to use more of a, I guess, later second edition or revised edition look at Mage, and that is where you want to take real world magical practices and have them as such in the game, just using sphere magic rules to do it. Okay, this helps you to do that. You're going to want to follow every detail of every rote, have every element there. People who take a an older approach to this might look at this and say, oh, okay, so the sphere mages use this as a starting point and they build on it, but the sorcerers, the hedge magic users, they do this exactly as put down here. So when I approach this chapter, I think of, okay, there's more than one ways to put this into my game. I just want to have my game plan ready as a storyteller before I say to players, hey, look at this material, which I would, because I like a lot of the material here. It's stuff worth using. I just like a little perspective on it before I jump in.
And with that, the reason we all came here today, Adam, will you tell us about the Etrurians?
Our final chapter is the Magic of Etruria, the empire of the Etruscans that the Romans knocked over long ago. We start with journal entries by Hermetic mage Gawain Alexander, who travels to Tarquinia in Italy with his apprentice after the rogue council hints there's something going on there. The two tradition mages sign on to an archaeological dig led by Professor Massimo Pallottino, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that, who seems to be less interested in archaeology and more interested in finding something valuable. This is another perspective on the events of the prologue fiction, and we see the same events play out. A page of notes by Euthanatos mage Marcus Jackson gives us some explanatory information and the end of the narrative. A page on Etruscan history, language, and religion sets us up nicely without getting too far into the weeds. A sidebar on Etruscan notions of predestination is very helpful for me for adding weight to the divination rotes we'll soon see. A bit of paradigm information, if you will, to help you understand why divination rotes are going to work so well. So the mage can put faith in them. This is the only chapter that gives us a lexicon and recommended reading list. Very mage appropriate. It's no secret by now that Terry and I appreciate these things. We get 2 divination rotes and 3 necromancy rotes. Kids, please don't try these at home. We see 2 wonders. The list of Etrurian gods was very nice. There's overlap with Greco-Roman myth, but plenty of new figures. The overlap makes it interesting to use with material from the first Dead Magic book, while the new gods stimulates my imagination. The monsters section gives us only 2 entries. The Carantes are basically specters from the Low Umbra that can materialize more easily, and Larth the Lich from the 2 fiction pieces that we have in this book. I thought this was a great chapter. When I evaluate a Dead Magic chapter, I want to know what magic mages will travel the world to uncover. Here we see lightning divination, another source of the Lich Road, and best of all, non-Indian necromancy, India meaning the Indian subcontinent. On that note, I thought more space should have been given to Etrurian necromancy and its rotes. Plot hooks and tie-ins to other mage plot elements are very rich here. We have valuable mage scrolls that were just unearthed but now reside in a panopticon construct, an ancient figure who can teach undiluted magic from a past era, several ways to include the mysterious Pallottino family mentioned in previous revised edition books. They specifically spell out several different ways to put Etruscan magic in your player's hands. So yeah, there's a lot to love on this chapter.
I thought this chapter, as you said, is action-packed. It has a bunch of things. I would have liked more information. I wanted more stuff. It did a bunch in terms of giving options for what you can actually play. It does that thing I love where it is alien, as you mentioned, the idea that it's like, yeah, we're going to do divination based on lightning. And you're like, oh, okay, that's one way to do it. And you're like, how do you get information about the future? Well, there's really 2 ways of doing it. Lightning and livers. And you're like, okay, yeah, the LNL of divination. I really like the presentation of the Pallottino family, that it doesn't need to be a super powered family in the sense of, oh, they have access to this ancient magic, but they may be the only Etruscan speakers left and they have these documents, and that your characters to do something need to get in good there. This is another chapter where it kind of gives the idea of the world of darkness being in motion, and I generally like that when it's appropriately balanced. As you mentioned, we got another Lich Rote, and the more Liches running around to muck up things, the better. I think it is nice when mages have interesting mage antagonists, and we're not just like, you're going up against a 5th gen Giovanni or something like that. It's neat when the comic book superhero has like their own special villain, and they don't have to steal someone else's villain. I would have liked more information. This one seemed closest on the Adam scale of deadness. This seemed to be the one that if we have the Norse on one end, or the Norse and the Dreamtime on one end, this is the one where it's on the other. It's like, they're dead. It's not quite dead magic, because technically liches are only half dead, but it's at least half dead magic. And I thought it was interesting and exciting. I thought this was a great book. My main criticism of the previous Dead Magic was that it was too dead. It was, let's raid other cultures. And in a lot of cases, those cultures still had some practitioners around where it's like, we're not dead yet. You're going to be dead any minute. And you're like,
Let me help with that.
Exactly. I'm not sure how I feel about that. So this was not quite Dead Magic, Too Dead, Too Furious. It had a bunch of extant cultural practices, but those that laid outside of the traditions. And I think Mage, you can very much either take the traditions and say, this covers all non-technocratic magic. Or you can take the route that says the traditions cover most, and that there will be crafts and other secret organizations outside of it. And this is just one set of them. I think both of those is perfectly reasonable. In M20, we kind of get the idea that the traditions don't contain all magic, they just contain a bunch of magic, and you have the disparates among other groups to fill that in. And books like this really help fill that in. It gives us a bunch more on cultural practices. I would love to see this updated to current times if we could, representing current scholarship and research and so on, because the more out of the popular mind a culture is in one of these books, the less trusting I generally am of the writing, the more easy it would be, I think, for an author to kind of step in it and fundamentally misrepresent another culture or to get something that is important wrong. That's just something to keep top of mind. This is a case where if you really liked these cultures that were outside what we've gotten and made so far, and you wanted an RPG source for them, I would start looking at Scion, either first or second edition, to get a little bit more information, especially if you're looking for ways to gamify it. Those are not perfect texts by any measure, but they already do the work of saying, hey, here's a belief, how can we be somewhat sensitive to it, or reasonably sensitive to it, while still creating something that is useful in a role-playing game. And exposure to another culture, even if it's slightly off, I still think does something that is culturally valuable. If you're going to an RPG book to get flawless information on the cultural practices of a people, that's concerning. But that's just me. I thought it was fun. I would have loved to get a secret, a Dead Magic 3. I think M20 super needs books like this, except for a little bit more focused on Paradigm.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good nuggets in this book. I would find it useful for a chronicle I'm running for any edition of Mage. Of course, everyone knows I love the Umbra, and so there's that Shallow Realms idea is one that I want to run with. But even apart from that, there's a number of things here. I think it's very interesting to say that the Euthanatos have potent necromancy, and that it's feared by mages all over the world. But it's like, oh, here's a whole new set of necromancy that has recently opened up, and that's going to just change everything. So that was a really cool idea. It's interesting to me that several chapters in here are more like a paradigm material, really, rather than lost magic. But again, it's interesting and it's good. It just makes it a little hard for people who see the title of the books, like, oh, Dead Magic, digging up ancient secrets. Okay, and there's a couple of chapters here. It's like, no, this isn't hidden. A lot of people doing this. Little weird for me there. But one idea that occurred to me while reading this is we need to, as mage fans, we need to consider how consensual reality changes over time. And of course, to briefly sum that up, thousands of years ago, mages could use very powerful magic to build a castle out of nothing that floats in the air and keeps floating year after year, and then they could live there and terrify the countryside. That was really, you could do really powerful effects thousands of years ago. Now you try to do that, not only will paradox smack you down, but magical spheres just won't produce that effect for you. You just cannot do that. The world has changed. The magical circumstances of our age are different from the circumstances of past ages. And so that is something to consider. You might dig up magic from 3,000 years ago and find that it just doesn't work. It just won't work now. That's something worth considering. I think it was the European Shamanism chapter, it gives a sidebar example of how you're probably going to have to take ancient rotes and change them a bit and experiment a bit to get them to work these days. On one level, I can see that. I think that's an interesting thing to put in a game. But it is also worth noting that there's something to be said for digging up thousands of year old magic and finding that, hey, look, no matter how I twist it, it just don't work no more. It's a different world we live in. So as a storyteller, I would keep that in mind and try to think through some of those things. And I think that can add richness to a story. I think your players can find out, oh, this magic doesn't work anymore. And that is a key for us to interpret all of this ancient lore that we have, that we sort of understood and sort of don't. Now we're understanding it more. And so information, not about how to use magic, but just, where things are and who's powerful and what's going on in the Umbra, now makes sense, now that we understand our paradigm and consensual reality a little better than we did before. So yeah, there's useful things you can do with this. It's just nice to pull all the concepts together in a chronicle. A revised edition has said constantly, especially in Heinig's run, that mages need to change with the times or go extinct. The Blood Treachery book said it was basically foolish to go looking for outdated magic. And so Dead Magic 1 and 2 argue in the other direction. And I don't see that as a problem with published mage books. I think it's interesting. As many people say, mage is about different perspectives. And so things that might look like a contradiction will turn out to be something different on closer inspection. But just as a mage fan, I think it's funny where one book says, no, don't dig up the old stuff. What are you, stupid? You got to change with the times. Another book says, hey, the really good stuff is what they did 4,000 years ago. So I thought that was fun.
It is an internal tension that you can certainly resolve, because in some cases you're like, maybe they're talking about changing mindset. But no, in other cases, they're literally talking about needing to have more contemporary magical practices. The book, I think, does do a good job of mentioning that, yes, these things have, in many cases, been attacked by consensual reality, but some of them are so great and so powerful, they still have import. Like in the Dreamtime section, it makes mention that to try and destroy the Dreamtime, any non-initiated mage attempting to work effects or locate or interact with the Dreamtime must pierce a 50 success ward erected before the dawn of history. And I'm like, yep, okay, yeah, that makes sense. That's good.
Yeah,
that's good. That's probably going to take more than a 3-day weekend. I gotcha. Maybe get some friends together.
I'm ready to share a few adventure ideas, and then I think we will roll to our conclusion. I've got 3 story ideas based on this book I was hoping to share with our listeners. Number 1, research for a chantry or mentor leads the players to several of the Polynesian islands. They encounter local mages who avoid them. After repeated signs of dark resonance, the players know something is happening in the region. Although local mages are uncooperative, the players learn a Nefandus had convinced the elder mages of the Marquesas Islands to travel the region, training local mages and sorcerers in routes that bear negative resonance to awaken one of the old gods sleeping in the deep. Local shamans swear the resonance is not negative, but non-Western. The local shamans plan to use aid from the old god to drive out the Westerners. The foreign Nefandus is a master at manipulating long-standing discontent against Westerners. The story could focus on magical duels against corrupted elders from the Marquesas Islands, and ultimately the Nefandus himself on islands where the dominant paradigm differs from the player's home. It could also focus on discussions with local mages about what modernization, opening up to foreign influences, and changing times really mean. Also, the fine line between recognizing injustice and giving in to resentment. Number 2, the new young leaders of the Council of Nine are unhappy about the number of tradition mages put in harm's way by messages from the Rogue Council. When a new message arrives hinting at a discovery in Australia, the players are sent to discover the Rogue Council followers there and report back. The players are surprised when they are met by a small group of Aboriginal mages and led to the outback, where they are led into the Dreamtime. The Aborigines will only say the winged god asked them to invite the foreign wise ones into their home. After amazing experiences in the Dreamtime, the players are sent home. An adept of the Order of Hermes, House Bonisagus, an expert in umbral lore and spirit magic, requests the players visit him. Immediately, the technocracy sends agents to capture the players. The new council leaders declare the players renegades. What do the players know that everyone fears? Can they keep themselves safe long enough to find out? Can they trust the help they're suddenly getting from the Hermetics? Number 3, rumors claim technocratic agents and tradition mages are disappearing in Italy and the Mediterranean coasts of Croatia, France, and Spain. Small constructs and chantries there occasionally go silent. After hearing this for some time, the players are approached at a Council of Nine gathering by a member of the Euthanatos, Pomegranate Dem. They are told the Pomegranate Dem suspect the Palatino family are behind the rumors. The Palatino family has long been recognized as a group within the Euthanatos, but the connection is weak. The family keeps to themselves. Agreements with the Euthanatos prevent the Pomegranate Dem from acting, but if the players will investigate their leads, they'll lend support. The players discover a powerful mage has taken leadership of the family and taught them frightening new techniques. A rumor says the new leader is an old Etruscan vampire who wields sphere magic, but isn't that impossible? The players will have to sort it out soon, because the family's next target is the leader of the Celestial Chorus visiting Rome. This story will provide stolen treasures from the family to help the players learn rare entropy and spirit rotes, plus the motivation to use them. Well, hopefully those ideas will spark some of your own. And Terry, is there a closing quote this time?
Oh, I really like the idea of liches being first interpreted as vampires that can still use sphere magic. That's a sweet one. And in my head, this lich was Christopher Lee. So the late Christopher Lee. In the prologue, The Ides of February, I have two, as I frequently cheat. The first is from the Polynesian magic system. After the guy talks a lot about cannibalism, his apprentice guest says, "So have you ever eaten anybody?" Mutt teased, smiling, "We're not talking about me right now." And then he just continues from there. But in the prologue, The Ides of February, there's a line where this lich is talking about his experiences and says, "At first she addressed Larth in the same language she had spoken to the Shade in, but when she saw Larth's brow furrow at its incomprehensibility, she spoke again in a tongue Larth was quite familiar with, one he'd heard over and over again during his imprisonment as he replayed the details of his ambush and capture in his mind. Latin. The woman spoke Latin. Could it be that the scions of Romulus still ruled above Tarka after so very long?" The disgust the character raises at the notion of being addressed in Latin is great. The intro section is so much fun. Really wish they could have gotten a third book out of it. And that's all for me.
All right. Well, if you have something to say, please contact us at magethepodcast@gmail.com with your questions, comments, or feedback. Subscribe to Mage the Podcast on iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, and other aggregators. If you like the show, others might like it too. And if you leave a review of Mage the Podcast, it makes us more visible in their searches. You can follow us on Twitter at Mage the Podcast. We're also on the web at magethepodcast.com. You can listen to past episodes there and see the complete show notes that we prepare for you. This episode is thanks to executive producers John Magnuson, Isabel Castillo-Lopez, Michael Kredel, Josh Hillerup, Ira Grace, Richard Batt Brewster, Michael Parker, Christopher Phillips, Ilara J. Sunsern, Bryce Perry, William Martin, John Horton, William Connolly, Brandon Morrill, Andrew Kotz, Jenna F., Andrew Edelstein, Chris Zack, Joshua Golden, Dan Svensson, Andy, Neil Patterson, Buck Farmer, Freddie, Anders, and Justin. If you would like to become an executive producer for Mage the Podcast, it would help us keep producing episodes like this one. You would also become a part of our own council to discuss upcoming projects. The link in the show notes will get you started. Well, thanks everyone for listening. Until next time, truth until paradox, baby.
Go destroy the scions of Rome. Bye.